So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Alexa Marshall, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's Creative Excellence Pharmaceutical Center of Excellence. Alexa, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you everyone for taking the time today to join us. We're here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is advertising, and specifically DTC, pharmaceutical advertising in particular. And so just to kind of kick off, the premise of this really is that we know that great ads need to be great ads no matter what the category, and that DTC advertising is still advertising despite some unique challenges that they have to tend to work with. But at the end of the day, DTC advertising still has to gain attention of the target audience. It has to link back to the brand well, and it has to motivate that target patient to take whatever intended action is warranted. So as I mentioned, though, we know that DTC advertising is unique in certain ways. It differs in that we have to typically work with unusual or hard to pronounce brand names, deliver complex messages, and oftentimes multiple messages in a single spot, and do so with a required fair balance that often takes up a significant chunk of time of, let's say, a typical DTC video spot. So the premise of our discussion today is really to talk about how advertisers can succeed with these category unique challenges, while knowing that the basic principles of advertising really still hold in terms of what it has to do to be successful. We've got 5 meaty topics to cover today during the next 25 minutes or so, and we've assembled a fantastic panel of expert practitioners here to help us understand how they think about DTC advertising and have used successful ways to kind of navigate these challenges. So with that, I would like to, I've been introduced, so I would like to have my panel introduce themselves. And Alicia, if I could start with you to kick off a little bit about yourself.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Nadesi. I'm a VP Account Director at 21 Grams, which is part of a Real Chemistry.
Great. Awesome. Akash?
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks, Alexa, for having us as part of the panel. My name is Akash Lal. I am a manager at Bristol Myers Squibb, part of the Customer and Market Insights team, currently supporting immunology, specifically on deucravacitinib, which is an oral medication for plaque psoriasis.
Awesome. Thanks, Akash. And Patrick?
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be in the world. I'm Patrick Armstrong, Senior Manager, Insights and Analytics. I'm based in Wilmington for AstraZeneca. I sit within our Global Insights and Analytics Center of Excellence. I'm aligned to the US business. I primarily support our respiratory portfolio, and I work closely with our commercial and sales leadership teams to help inform them with evidence-based decision making to ultimately inform product strategy and tactics. And so our organization is an extremely data-driven organization. Advertising is an instrumental part of that. And one of the pillars of our organization is patient centricity. It really drives what we do every day. And I can tell you that I work with some really incredible people who are dedicated to that goal. So thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate it. Great. So without further ado, I wanted to get into the first of the 5 topics. And the first one that we want to really talk about is branding, brand linkage, branding, and why brand sort of memory devices are really key. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we know that pharmaceutical brands often have challenges with, you know, challenging names to pronounce, so on and so forth. You know, they're novel words, not normal, not within the usual day-to-day nomenclature, if you will. And to that end, that could pose a unique challenge to really aligning, garnering brand memorability. So it seems like it's a little bit more of like key importance in this particular category, that creative really has to kind of go beyond just showing the brand name, showing the logo as kind of table stakes and cost of entry, and really that achieving strong brand linkage requires really building distinctive brand assets and memorable features that can really help the brain tie back to the specific brand name. And doing that, you know, we've known from our research that different branding devices, you can see here in terms of what's being shown on the slide, unique colors, the campaign consistency or continuity, certain jingles, ensuring brand integration, using unique characters. Those are types of things that often we see within pharma that tend to aid in terms of brand memorability. So Patrick, if I can start with you on this topic, thinking of times within the creative development process, you know, when for one of your brands, you know, have you thought about these particular aspects as it pertains to how you think about creative development and leveraging these to really instill that brand memorability?
It's a topic that we're very much focused on every day. I can tell you that. And just to go back to something that you had mentioned, Alexa, at the outset, was the fact that oftentimes the therapeutic assets that we put into market have difficult to pronounce names. As consumers of healthcare, I think we're all familiar with that. We've all struggled to pronounce those names at times. And I think maybe perhaps the average person might not realize, but there's a reason why that's the case. We're held to certain standards by the FDA, just in terms of the product naming itself. There's certain guidelines that we have to follow, such as the name not being misleading about what the drug is capable of treating, for example, or perhaps what that drug is made of. The drug name can't be used for promotional messaging. There are often root words or other language that could be construed as having a bad connection, and so those are things that we also have to pressure test when we think about naming a particular therapy. And they can't be too similar, and I think that's probably one of the most important reasons. So the goal is to ultimately prevent any confusion amongst patients, but also prescribers when they're thinking about prescribing those medications to their patients. So safety is a critical factor there. And so, yes, I mean, we're very much aware of the challenges of memorability. We're aware of the challenges of pronunciation. And so there are a few things from a DTC perspective that we can use to help overcome some of those challenges. One of those things that we can do includes repetition. So we have found that repeating the brand name of the product early and often, both visually and audibly, can help to solidify that brand equity, that brand recognition, and long-term memory. Another thing that we can turn to is using mnemonic devices or techniques as ways to, again, help one memorize. So that's effectively using phrases or ideas that have patterns to them, which can include poems, it can include rhymes, images, acronyms. There's a couple ways to go about it. Another technique that in recent years has really taken off in pharma is using music or pop music. So depending on the target audience, one might want to select music that's relevant from a particular decade or a particular era to really hit home with that relevance and familiarity. And so all of those things can help to, again, just foster familiarity, engagement with the brand and its association.
Great.
And just a couple of quick examples. So again, I work in inhaled respiratory. Breastry is my main focus. And we have some mnemonic devices worked into our current spot. If you have COPD, ask your doctor about Breztri. Trelegy, which is a GSK product, our competitor, for a number of years, they had a Trelegy 1, 2, 3 campaign that borrowed from Jackson 5, which was tremendously popular, and that asset has very strong brand recognition. And you all have probably heard the Ozempic commercial that uses the song titled Magic by Pilot. So those are just a few examples that are aimed at driving that memorability and that stickiness factor.
That's great. Thanks, Patrick. And Akash, to that end, just turning to you on this, we know that branding in and of itself is a challenge for a brand, but then when you're advertising something in a crowded category, on top of everything, with lots of competition that's running consistently. So how have you specifically approached this, with respect to, as Patrick gave some really great examples, but from your standpoint, leveraging, sort of memorable elements or techniques like alliteration or anything like that to help drive, have you help drive that on what you're working on?
Absolutely. It's something we're thinking a lot about right now. Just to contextualize it for the audience and for everyone here, being in the psoriasis space, it's a very crowded market. There are many competitors that exist right now, both oral products as well as injectable biologics, first and second generation products. So all of these competitors are definitely making a lot of noise. They have various different DTC campaigns running and different tactics by which they are trying to capture the attention of patients. That being said, it's definitely very crowded. One thing, though, that we hear a lot of times when we're doing research with patients is that they may or may not be familiar with some of the different DTC campaigns. And if they are, they sometimes have trouble associating a particular campaign with a particular product. So I think that partly underscores the problem we're trying to solve for. The second piece of that, too, is psoriasis is a space where patient request plays a really important role. And it's definitely a consideration for HCPs when they're prescribing a product. If the patient comes in and they say, "Oh, I've heard of whatever competitive product it is," that definitely does play a role in the mind of the HCP, and it definitely raises their awareness and potential to prescribe. That being said, with the crowded market, with the role of patient request, DTC is super important to us. So I think Patrick outlined so many different great techniques that we can potentially leverage. A couple of things that we're thinking about, right? Because as you said, Alexa, some of these names are hard to pronounce. Some of them are difficult to remember. One thing is potentially using alliteration in a quick and easy, catchy tagline to rhyme or to go along with the brand name, top of mind, so that hopefully when the patient gets to the doctor's office, they can easily remember that tagline and have the product name top of mind. However, I think that one of the issues is that being hard to remember, we also have to go with specific creative elements that stand out really well, because sometimes the patient might get to the doctor and not remember the brand name at all. So is there a specific creative element that we can introduce as part of our campaign? Is it a animated logo? So when they get to the doctor's office, they say, "Oh, I want the drug with the dancing animation," or something like that. Is it, another opportunity with some sort of standout or element with stopping power, so they can at least remember some aspect of the campaign? Hopefully, between the doctor and patient, they'll remember the product. That's
great. Thanks, Akash, for that. And so, Alicia, from a creative standpoint, right? So an agency standpoint, from that perspective, knowing that it's so important to begin with, and really think about early on in the process, and knowing the unique challenges, obviously, that we've all mentioned. So how do you approach that from a creative perspective, and does it differ for how you think about DTC versus other categories? Like, would you have a different process or not?
I think, yeah, on the agency's side of it, the concepting part is one of our favorite things to do. And especially when you come part of it too, the memory device is part of that concepting. So when you look into other research, regardless if we're doing DTC or another advertising, they're still humans, they're still patients, they're still buying something and talking to a doctor. So you still take it as the same approach, in our opinion. What we do lean on a lot is there are other market research you can lean into. We have lexicons, there's things going into here. So if it's not just the brand name, there's other areas you could do to start figuring out what kind of language you need to capture into your ads based on the language they're already using in the market or what they're already trying to say, and just leveraging those a little bit more. You go in the concepting phase of it, you're looking at all of that. And it's a long process. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes your day-to-day team. It's pulling other team members from other creative teams within your agency, and they're working day and night. They're going to the grocery store, they're thinking about it. They're working till midnight as a collaborating together and brainstorming together. It's a long process. And at the end of the day, like, it's thinking about everything in there. Like, there's parts we've talked about too in here is thinking about your target market. It could end up being one of these ads could be about realizing your target market is 60 plus, you know what media channels they're in, you know what kind of things they're interested in, and just adding that to the concept you're working on. Do you need a nostalgic song that goes with the ad at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's great. That's great perspective. Thank you for that. Transitioning to the second topic, which is really around, around relevance and information. It's all about relevance. That's the second topic here. And what I think is interesting is that perhaps surprisingly, what we have found is that DTC ads actually tend to break through more than the average ad. And this could be because you're trying to reach very targeted, very specific targeted people that are attuned to the message and attuned to what you're trying to say. But to that end, we do see, and the data shows it here, that generally speaking, DTC ads for people like me and relevant to me. Those are things that really stand out in general, more so than when we look at just the all category average on these same metrics. So Akash, I'd love to start with you on this one. And I know that, you know, one of the ways that you've addressed this is by bringing patients into the creative development process pretty early on to really understand what is most meaningful and what's most relevant to them. And so could you speak a bit about this in terms of the things that you've done that's helped your teams really get to the point where then from an advertising standpoint, you really know you're hitting the mark in terms of relevance?
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things that we have to consider when crafting these DTC campaigns, these ads, is taking a step back and really getting a foundational understanding of how our patients think, feel, act, behave. What is the treatment and emotional journey that they've been through? So as a market researcher, I think one of the key things that we do is really get a foundational knowledge through various different types of studies. So for example, in a launch as we have right now for psoriasis, we're doing everything we can to understand the patients. Who are these patients? What do they experience and what do they go through? You can imagine some of the key kinds of studies and research that we're doing, right? It's the patient treatment journey, it's patient messaging, and then eventually patient segmentation. And through each of these different pieces of research, we're able to start understanding, really how we can best communicate and speak to these patients, because making things relevant to them comes from understanding who they are and what they've been through. And we can translate that into meaningful, impactful ads. So before we even get to the stage of crafting the DTC, it's really going through the entire process of understanding them. And then once we have understood the broader universe, if you will, of patients who with the condition, we can drill down into our specific segments and targets, and then say, here's how we want to appropriately capture their attention.
That's great. And building on that, Patrick, with your COPD focus, when you think about creative development, what's the mindset or approach that you're taking to sort of ensure that, the final touch points that you're producing are relevant to your target audience?
Again, great question, and I'm in full consensus with everything that Akash said. So, look, I mean, we tend to conceptualize a patient as this abstract thing, but a patient is you. A patient is myself, right? I mean, we're all consumers of healthcare at one time or another, and so it's important to keep that in mind. And so it's, I think, keeping that spirit, keeping that focus, and looking to speak to your target audience on a human level, understanding what their basic needs, their desires, their personal experience is. Healthcare, disease, pathology is an extremely personal and often it's an extremely stigmatized and embarrassing topic. And so we've got to be very tactful and thoughtful in how we approach those topics. COPD, for example, is a very emotional disease, and we often find that there's a disconnection between the rational and the emotional experience that folks undergo as they come to terms with the disease and what it means for them. It's a progressive disease that happens over a long period of time, unfortunately. And so part of what we intend to do through our campaigns is creating moments of meaning through that storytelling. Some of that is addressing the unmet need in that disease space, but some of that is meeting the patients where they are and connecting with what's most important to them. So as an example, again, going back to the spot that we have on television at the moment for Breztri, for those who experience COPD, especially more severe disease, they're often restricted in the daily activities that they can do. They have increased difficulty with breathing. They're not able to go out and enjoy activities with their family. Pollen, pollutants, other things can cause flare-ups and inflammation. And so they're not able to get out and enjoy things with their family and their friends as they once were. And so in our spot, again, it's crafted in such a way that it presents the problem and Breztri is the solution. And there's visual imagery in there that shows a woman who's able to get back out, have a picnic with her family in the park. And that's, so that those kinds of things tend to be more aspirational and what's desired. So again, it's just providing that kind of support in our advertisements that folks can hopefully get on a therapy that allows them to get back to some sense of normalcy and enjoy their time with their friends and family.
That's great. Thank you for that. Just in the interest of time, because I actually know I jumped over one topic, I'd love to, Alicia, if I can, jump to the next topic actually, and have you lead off on this one, get your perspective in terms of driving more creativity into the process. So this particular topic is really interesting, and I think from our perspective, we know that we've seen how, and just discussed from Patrick and Akash, how relevant advertising and informative advertising, as some of the data showed, really does tend to drive attention. That being said, interestingly, in the pharma category, and as we can see here, there is this sentiment of the sea of sameness, right? That most of the ads are slice of life, and coming back to the fact that one of the challenges is around fair balance and having to work that in from a creative standpoint. We do see there isn't typically a lot of variety in terms of pharma advertising, and 97% of the ads that we test have actually been coded as slice of life. So some opportunities there to maybe see if there are ways to drive more creativity. So from your perspective, Alicia, just wanted to understand kind of your thoughts on the creative development process around how you're truly developing the creative as it pertains to pharma, given what we typically see, and maybe some insights as to why you might think that there's a lot of sort of sea of sameness, if you will.
Yeah, I think every single time someone is about to kick off a new concept for a TV spot, they want to avoid doing another pharma ad. We keep seeing the same things over and over in the market, and we want to try to do something that's going to stick a little bit in a different way and get the patients to go and ask their doctor about this prescription and request it itself. So for example, most of my industry has been in oncology. That's a sensitive topic. So there's a lot you need to say in a short period of time, and there are challenges. We've brought up a few times with conversations like that fair balance that takes up half of your ad, but there's still a way that you can go into telling the story and not just have a slice of life. It could be even setting up the problem at the very beginning of like, if you're worked in prostate cancer, so is your PSA rising? These patients are hyper focused on it. So what is going to grab their attention early on and not just show that one moment in their life. So it's something they've been focused on for probably the past 5-10 years of their lives. If it's the loved one, even if it's their loved ones, even too, these loved ones are very involved in their prostate cancer, any type of cancer, any kind of disease state they have. So it's going to be relevant to both just that patient and their caregiver. And then still trying to get that emotion pulled through as you're going through the fair balance, and at the end of the day, going with the call to action. There are ways to still avoid that slice of life and only show that one moment happening in their life and try to show a little bit more happening and how it's going to make a difference and they're going to have a benefit being on that treatment or changing treatments.
Okay, that's great. And I'm going to go a little off script here, but one other question for Patrick or Akash on this one, just because I do want to hit the D&I, the next topic to close out the webinar. But just from a client standpoint, is there an expectation or sort of a acknowledgement that ads will typically be slice of life? Or do you ever push on the creative? Do you ever push on Alicia, for example, to have some, from a creative standpoint, be a little bit more unique or different, knowing what typical DTC pharma advertising typically looks like? Either one of you, a little off script here, but just curious to your thoughts.
I'm happy to start, Patrick, if we want to tag team the question. Yeah, I think, Alexa, it's a really important consideration for us. That being said, it's an interesting challenge to solve for, right? On the one hand, we often hear that a consumer can tell when an ad looks pharma, right? Like they know based on the slice of life, they tell us this looks very pharma typical. On the other hand, I think sometimes we present something very out of the box, maybe something a little bit more maybe metaphorical, or that involves a lot of deeper level thinking, and it's just too much to take in a quick maybe 60-second ad. So we really have to strike the right balance. And what I will say is, for us, what we've been doing is bringing patients into the creative development process very early on. So rather than testing fully final concepts, maybe in storyboard or even animated videos, we've actually been bringing patients in the rudimentary, very raw concepting stage. So we present to them maybe a mood board and maybe a paragraph describing what our concept intent is, and bring them in there at that point, so we can work together with them and drive creative that's actually meaningful and hopefully strike that balance.
That's great. Patrick, any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and again, in full consensus, we go through many rounds of research, bringing those stakeholders in to really get their thoughts, opinions, feelings as we go along, because we want it to be relevant to them. And again, I mean, I think Akash hit the nail on the head. Like, I think we see this sameness, right? It's not because slice of life doesn't work; it does. But it's just that everyone's doing it, and so it tends to sort of wash out, and it just becomes more of a noise instead of a signal. And so there's I know on my team there's been a heavy focus to do more innovative techniques from a creative perspective to stand out from the crowd. Symbicort being one of those examples. So Symbicort was on, it's no longer, but it was on television for a long time. And there was the Wolf campaign. And again, just to go back to this topic of sameness, again, there's actually some benefits to sameness. We've all seen whether it's the X-Men or Marvel movies that are in their 6th, 7th, 8th iteration, we kind of see those same techniques in pharma advertising as well. So for Symbicort Wolf, I believe that there were 5 or 6 what we call pullouts that were created that built on the previous spot.
Yep.
And so it was using that brand equity that we had built, using that familiarity but introducing some new life into it to continue that campaign along. And it was, and from that regard, it was a tremendously successful campaign. For Bread Street, we're now in our second iteration. So we are utilizing our Get Real framework, where we start the commercial in an animated world. It's an animation, it's not a live shot, so it's intended to be captivating and engaging and like different, right, from the other pharmaceutical commercials that we're all used to seeing on TV. And so, as Akash again said, we don't want it to be so abstract that there's so much crammed into a 60-second spot that it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Balanced in such a way that the majority of folks are able to understand what that situation or what that story is that we're relaying to them.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know we are over time, but for those hardy souls who would like to stay on, I did want to just talk about one more topic, get everyone's thoughts briefly on that. And that's the topic of diversity and inclusion. And so just very quickly from my end, we know from data that I'm showing up here to summarize very briefly, we do know that on average, consumers are really feeling that advertisers can be doing more in this space. And in fact, again, more generalized data that we have just saying, really wanting to see more people of color being depicted in positions of power, having women be seen in more like decisive and accomplished ways. And it kind of interestingly ties to the slice of life conversation in terms of how you actually do that. But just wanted to just get very quick bites from each of you on this topic, because it obviously is very important. And I know that companies are thinking about this, brands are thinking about this even more. So Alicia, if I could just quickly get a few nuggets on your thoughts in terms of just, for you having an important, how important having like a diverse team is in terms of like a creative development team to really ensure that you're developing creative that's, culturally authentic. So just a couple thoughts from you on that would be great.
Yeah, I think all companies are taking this very serious, and they're looking at this as a whole from the very beginning of any idea. So for example, in an agency perspective, you still have your day-to-day team, but we take all concepting out further. We have internal teams that we've built together that have a diversity. So it's different races, it's genders, it's ages, and we take a larger look at any idea, and that's come out. Like, it's things that you wouldn't even think about. For example, we recently were going to do a coat check scene with one of our photo shoots, and we were thinking about this. A lot of us live in larger cities and have moved, but New York City is a melting pot. So a lot of us have moved into there. We're from very rural areas. So coat check made sense in like Philly, New York City, Northern Jersey. But when you're advertising to all the United States, it actually may not make sense. So having that diverse of groups together to like think and just like feel comfortable talking out loud, it can make a difference in a campaign, or even down the road with messaging or anything in that aspect of it.
That's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, when you really step out and think broader than kind of your particular situation, it makes a difference. That's really helpful. Akash, briefly, I know we talked about how, advertising psoriasis, an interesting one in terms of just skin color and how people, how people of color have or have not really seen themselves represented in advertising specifically related to this condition. So if you wouldn't mind just talk a little bit about that and how you've approached that, would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, Alexa, one of the things that we were chatting about quite recently, right, is this idea that in dermatology, and particularly psoriasis, it has been challenging, I think, historically, to diagnose skin conditions in patients of color. It often leads to different misdiagnoses or longer treatment journeys in terms of getting patients to the appropriate treatment and making sure that they have the correct psoriasis diagnosis. And you can imagine the impact that has on patients physically, for sure, but also emotionally along their treatment journey. So one of the things that we are keeping very acutely aware is the fact that a condition like psoriasis does impact individuals of various different races and ethnicities. And this representation is intentional. It's not something that, you know, I think is being done just out of the name of tying D&I in to our campaign and our thought processes, but actually because this is a condition that does affect people from all races, all ethnicities, all walks of life. So we're doing our best to really represent that. The other thing I'll add quickly, I know we're short on time, is the idea that capturing the patient's attention and really connecting with them can often transcend what you're showing, but also ties into the emotional connect that you're trying to get with them. Sometimes you can get even beyond, does the patient look like me? You can show them, emotionally speaking, I'm able to connect with this campaign by tying that in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. That's great. And Patrick, the last word here, you've done a lot of early stage work with us. And in fact, I think from a positive standpoint, actually got some favorable feedback with respect to what you were testing in terms of how you were portraying different races and ethnicities, genders, and so on and so forth. So maybe just a quick blurb on that, and then how, you know, that is a key sort of part of your creative development process to consider D&I pretty substantially. So turn it to you for the last word.
Thank you. And this is there's a lot to unpack here, and I don't think we have the time for it today, unfortunately. But it's an extremely important topic, something that really permeates our organization from top to bottom, and it's very much true for what we do with our campaigns as well. So, I mean, the goal, right, is to reach a diverse audience, not only because all brands should seek to market in such a way that reflects our world, but it could literally be a matter of life and death. So to go back to what I said at the beginning of this conversation, right, was that our core goal is patient centricity and getting the right medication to the right patients. I would call out and encourage you all to check out Tezspire's new consumer campaign, which is launched very recently. There's a brand new website that's up, and it's a really exciting, really cool campaign where I think it's the most inclusive campaign I've ever seen in pharma. It really appeals to a young, more technologically driven group of folks. It's for an asthma biologic. And it connects with those folks in a way that it uses storytelling that's relevant to them and to their experience. But thinking about diversity and inclusion, there's a lot of sociocultural history that we could go into, just in terms of mistrust of institutions and government amongst various groups of the population, inadequate access to healthcare resources. So all of those things are topics that we should be thinking about as well, as a position of responsibility as a pharmaceutical manufacturer. And so it's also, while it's, I think, addressing diversity and inclusion from the patient perspective, one of the things that we're also focused on is the lack of representation, which I think is not talked about as often in the healthcare industry, which can lead to unconscious bias. It can lead to ineffective communication. And so as researchers, as marketers, I think it's incumbent upon us to also, again, understand those issues behind healthcare professionals. And so from, again, somewhat of an aside, but from a physician perspective, we're also working to bring personas and helping to dimensionalize the patient and some of the assets that we're putting in front of physicians as well, to continue to adopt and drive those best practices as a means to address the topic of diversity and inclusion.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you. I know we were over time. Thank you to all of you who stayed on, or if you had to drop off, as Ellen mentioned, this has been recorded, or is still being recorded. I would like to really extend my thanks to the three of you, Alicia, Patrick, Akash. Thank you so much for doing this, for joining. For those of you in the audience, we didn't get to any questions because we ran over. We would be happy to address those. And otherwise, thank you all for your time. Thanks for taking the time to everyone who joined, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexa. Bye.
Thank you.